He had always liked how quiet the place was. The road that led to his home was narrow, slightly uneven, and lined with old trees that had been there longer than most of the houses nearby. It was not fancy, but it was solid. His family had owned the land for years, long before developers arrived and long before the neighborhood signs, rules, and monthly fees became part of daily life. When he bought the property, one of the main reasons he felt comfortable was that the road was his. It was written clearly in the papers. The road was private, built decades earlier to reach the land. He paid for its upkeep himself. When it cracked, he fixed it. When storms washed parts of it away, he brought in gravel and handled it without asking anyone for help. Life was simple that way. Over time, houses began appearing beyond his property. A developer bought land nearby and built a planned community. Clean sidewalks, matching mailboxes, and neat lawns followed. Then came the Homeowners Association. At first, it barely affected him. He was not a member. His home sat just outside the official boundary. The HOA meetings, rules, and fines were not his concern, at least. That is what he believed. One afternoon, after a long day of work, he pulled into his driveway and noticed a bright envelope tucked halfway into his mailbox. It stood out immediately. Everything else was dull and familiar, but this envelope looked official. Thick paper. Sharp print. No friendly tone. He opened it casually at first, expecting nothing more than a misplaced notice or maybe something meant for a neighbor. But as he read the first few lines, his shoulders tightened. The letter stated that he was in violation of HOA rules related to road maintenance and unauthorized use of community property. It listed a fine amount and warned that additional penalties would follow if payment was not made within a short period. He read it again. Slower this time? The road mentioned in the letter was the same one he had always owned. At first, he laughed softly, shaking his head. It had to be a mistake. Maybe someone new on the board did not understand the layout of the area. Maybe they confused his road with one inside the community. Errors happened all the time, especially with paperwork. Still, something about the wording bothered him. The letter did not sound unsure. It did not ask questions. It stated facts, at least from their point of view. It spoke with authority, as if the matter was already settled. That night, he placed the letter on the kitchen table and ate dinner in silence. He replayed the words in his head, trying to understand how they could claim ownership over something that clearly was not theirs. The road had existed before the HOA ever formed. He knew that for certain. The next morning, he decided to handle it calmly. He gathered his property documents, including the survey maps and deeds that showed the road as part of his land. He believed that once the HOA saw the paperwork, the issue would be resolved quickly. He contacted the HOA office and asked to speak with someone about the letter. The response was polite but cold. He was told that the fine was valid and that if he disagreed, he could submit a written appeal. That surprised him. He asked if anyone had reviewed the land records. The person on the phone said the board had already determined that the road was under HOA jurisdiction. No further explanation was given. When the call ended, he felt the first real wave of concern. This was no simple mistake. They were confident. Too confident. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one was firmer. It reminded him of the unpaid fine and added a late fee. The amount was still manageable, but the tone was threatening. It mentioned possible legal action if the issue remained unresolved. He noticed something else, too. The letter was addressed not just to him, but to property occupant. It felt impersonal, as if he were just another problem to be handled. As he walked down the road that evening, he noticed unfamiliar tire marks and footprints along the edges. It looked like someone had been inspecting the surface, measuring, observing. That bothered him more than the letters. He had not given anyone permission to step onto his property. Neighbors began to act differently as well. A few avoided eye contact. Others spoke in low voices when he passed. One neighbor quietly mentioned that the HOA had been asking questions about the road and who controlled it. He started to realize that this situation was bigger than a single fine. The HOA seemed determined to claim the road, and once they did, it would open the door to rules, fees, and control he never agreed to. One afternoon, an HOA representative showed up unannounced. The person stood at the edge of the road, holding a clipboard and taking notes. When asked why they were there, the response was simple. They were documenting community infrastructure. He reminded them that the road was private. The representative did not argue. They simply wrote something down and left. That night, he could not sleep well. His mind kept returning to the same thought. If the HOA succeeded, what would stop them from doing this to others? If they could claim a road that was not theirs, what else could they take? Another letter arrived a week later. This one warned of escalating penalties. It mentioned liens, restrictions, and enforcement actions. The language was heavy and intimidating. He felt a mix of anger and disbelief. He had always followed the law. He paid his taxes. He took care of his land. Yet here he was, being treated like someone who had broken rules he never agreed to follow. Still, refused to panic. He knew the truth was on his side. He began organizing everything carefully. Old photographs of the road, maintenance receipts, legal descriptions. Anything that showed the road existed as part of his property long before the neighborhood around it changed. As he gathered these papers, he felt a growing sense of determination. This was not just about money. It was about ownership, respect, and standing up against unfair authority. He also noticed something else during this time. Several neighbors quietly reached out. They shared stories of fines that made no sense, rules that kept changing, and pressure to comply without question. Many of them felt powerless, afraid to challenge the HOA. Listening to them strengthened his resolve. He decided that he would not simply pay to make the problem go away. He would not stay silent. If the HOA wanted to push this issue forward, he would be ready by the end of that week. The situation had already grown tense. What started as a single letter had turned into an ongoing conflict. The road, once just a quiet path home, had become the center of a growing dispute. And this was only the beginning. After the first wave of letters and the unexpected visit, things began to feel heavier. The homeowner thought the initial confusion would be sorted quickly. He believed that showing proof of ownership would end the whole issue. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that the HOA was not planning to back down. Instead, they were escalating, and every move they made seemed calculated to put pressure on him. It started with more letters. Each one was stricter than the last, full of official language and warnings. One mentioned the authority of the board to manage all roads within the community, as if his property had been swallowed by invisible lines. Another letter added additional fees for inspection costs and administrative expenses. There was no explanation for why these amounts had been added. The numbers grew quickly, though the road itself had never caused anyone trouble. He read each letter carefully, making notes. The language was designed to intimidate. Non-compliance may result in legal action, it said. The board's decision is final. Reading those words again, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had never felt threatened by any neighbor or authority before, yet here he was, being told that he might face legal action for something that belonged to him. Neighbors began to act strangely as well. Some avoided him like they did not want to get involved. Others whispered when he walked by, glancing at the road or the mailbox with unease. A few even suggested quietly that he should consider paying the fines to avoid trouble. The thought of surrendering his rights was unbearable. But he could see why others might fear the HOA. Their letters had a tone of absolute power, and anyone who did not comply seemed like they would pay a steep price. One afternoon, a representative from the HOA showed up again. This time, the visit was longer and more deliberate. The person walked along the road, measuring distances, jotting down numbers on a clipboard, and taking photographs. When asked why they were on private property, they said they were conducting a community infrastructure review. He reminded them firmly that this was private property, that the road belonged to him, and that no one had permission to step onto it. The representative nodded politely, but continued taking measurements. The encounter left him more anxious than ever. Days later, another letter arrived. This one marked urgent. It stated that legal action would begin if the fines were not paid immediately. The letter also included a timeline of escalating penalties and suggested that the homeowner might be liable for attorney fees, court costs, and even liens on his property. The weight of the words settled over him. For the first time, he felt the reality that this fight could consume more than just his time. It could threaten his home. Despite the mounting pressure, he refused to give in. He spent the next few days reviewing his property papers, deeds, and old maps. Every document reinforced the same truth. The road was his. It was built and maintained by previous owners with every expense accounted for. He realized that the HOA was not responding to facts, but to their perception of authority. They believed that their position, their titles, and their rules gave them power over anyone who lived near the community. This realization fueled him. He began thinking strategically. If he wanted to protect his property, he would need to show them clearly, without ambiguity, that they were wrong. He started organizing his paperwork, creating a timeline of ownership and maintenance records for the road. He also collected photographs showing the road over the years, evidence that it predated the HOA's creation. At the same time, he noticed subtle changes around the neighborhood. Some homeowners, perhaps intimidated by the letters and visits, began following HOA rules more strictly than before. Others quietly expressed frustration, but none were willing to speak openly. He realized that the HOA's tactics were not just about him, they were about control. The letters, visits, and fines were designed to make residents comply without question. One evening, as he walked the road in the fading light, he felt a mixture of determination and unease. The road had always been a symbol of freedom, a private space that connected his home to the outside world. Now it felt like a battlefield. He thought about how much time and effort it had taken to maintain the road over the years. The gravel he had spread, the cracks he had repaired, the storms he had weathered, they all felt like small victories that were now being challenged. Meanwhile, the HOA began contacting other residents directly. He heard from a neighbor that the board had been asking questions about the road and who used it. They were gathering opinions, taking sides, and quietly pressuring others to support their claims. The homeowner realized that the board was trying to isolate him, making him appear as the only person standing against the rules. The tactic made sense. If no one else spoke up, they could frame the conflict as a personal dispute rather than an issue of property rights. Feeling the urgency, he decided to visit the local records office. He spent hours poring over old property maps, surveying the area, and collecting legal documents that clearly showed the road had been privately owned for decades. The work was tedious, but each piece of evidence strengthened his confidence. He began to understand that knowledge was his most powerful weapon. If the HOA could use authority, he could use facts. As he left the records office, he noticed the sun setting behind the trees lining his road. There was a calm in that moment, a quiet reminder of why he was fighting. The road had always belonged to his family. It was part of the home he loved. No letters, no fines, and no threats could change that truth. Back home, he shared his findings with a few trusted neighbors who had expressed concern. They were surprised at how clear the documentation was. Some admitted they had been afraid to stand up against the HOA themselves. Their fear reinforced his resolve. If he gave in, it would send a message that intimidation worked. If he stood firm, he might inspire others to protect their own rights. The pressure continued. Another representative appeared one morning, this time arriving earlier than expected. They were polite but insistent, taking measurements, snapping photographs, and noting any apparent issues with the road. He asked again to see documentation proving the HOA had authority over the road. The representative refused to provide it, citing board discretion. The lack of transparency only made the situation feel more unfair. He began recording every interaction carefully, noting dates, times, and names. He wanted to create a clear record of events, knowing that any future legal proceedings would depend on accuracy. He also continued updating his timeline of ownership and maintenance, creating a comprehensive file that left no room for doubt. Despite the stress, he tried to maintain normal life. He mowed the lawn, fixed broken fences, and spent quiet evenings reading by the fire. He understood that allowing fear to take over would only give the HOA more power. By focusing on daily routines and small victories, he reminded himself that he was in control of what mattered most, his home and his property. One evening, as he looked down the road he had walked so many times, he noticed a small group of neighbors standing by their mailboxes. They glanced at him nervously. One finally spoke, saying that they had also received letters and fines from the HOA. Others nodded silently. It became clear that he was not alone in facing intimidation. Even if he was the first to resist openly, the realization strengthened him further. If the HOA thought they could push him aside, they underestimated the power of facts, preparation, and courage. He began making plans for the next steps, gathering more evidence, speaking with legal counsel, and preparing to challenge the fines formally. Even with this growing determination, a part of him remained wary. He had seen how the HOA operated, confident, intimidating, and sometimes ruthless. He knew that the fight would not be easy. The letters, visits, and threats were just the beginning. Each day brought new pressure, new reminders that they believed the road was theirs. But he also knew that the truth was on his side. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence he had collected reinforced a simple fact. The road was private. It was part of his property. And no matter how many letters arrived, no matter how many representatives showed up, the truth could not be erased. By the end of the second week, the tension had reached a new level. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he also felt a quiet sense of resolve. He would not be bullied. He would not be silenced. And he would not allow an unfair claim to stand. What started as a simple notice had grown into a battle. The road he had once walked without worry now symbolized much more ownership, justice, and standing up against power used unfairly. He understood that the coming weeks would be challenging, but he also felt the first sparks of hope. With careful planning, clear evidence, and a steadfast determination, he was ready to face whatever the HOA would throw at him next. The tension had been building for weeks, and the homeowner knew that the next step was critical. The letters, visits, and fines from the HOA had shown no sign of stopping, and he realized that reasoning alone would not work. They refused to listen, refused to acknowledge the truth, and refused to provide any documentation proving their claims. Every day it felt like the weight of their authority pressed harder, but he also knew that giving in was not an option. The road was his, and he was determined to prove it. He started his mornings early, often before sunrise, walking the road slowly, almost ceremoniously. Each crack, each patch of gravel, each worn section of asphalt reminded him of the years of care that had gone into maintaining it. He had repaired sections himself, called contractors when needed, and had records of every expense. This was not just a road. It was a piece of history, a symbol of effort, care, and rightful ownership. He spent hours in his home office, surrounded by files, papers, and photographs. Every document he had collected was carefully cataloged. Old surveys, receipts from road repairs, property deeds dating back decades, and even old photographs showing the road before the neighborhood existed. He wanted every detail in order. If the HOA wanted to challenge him, he would be ready. One afternoon, he visited the county records office. The building was quiet, filled with the soft rustle of papers and the occasional sound of a stamp hitting a deed. He spent hours going through maps, historical property records, and official surveys. Each discovery reinforced what he already knew. The road had always been part of his property. Nothing the HOA claimed had any legal standing as he worked. He realized that many of the roads in the neighborhood had murky ownership histories. Some were built by developers, but never properly recorded. Others were claimed by the HOA after the community formed, often without consulting property owners. It was a pattern, a system that allowed the HOA to assert power over residents without solid legal backing. He also learned about other homeowners who had faced similar issues. Some had quietly paid fines, intimidated into submission, even though they had legal proof that the HOA had no authority. Others had ignored the letters, hoping the problem would disappear, only to receive harsher penalties later. Listening to these stories, he understood that the fight was not just about his road, It was about standing up against an organization that had overstepped its boundaries. One neighbor, a retired man who had lived in the area for decades, shared a story that stayed with him. He explained how the HOA had fined him for minor violations, like planting flowers outside his own yard, and had threatened legal action when he refused to pay. "They rely on fear," the neighbor said quietly. "Most people don't fight. They just pay because it's easier. You're not like most people." The homeowner appreciated the encouragement, but also felt the weight of responsibility. Fighting the HOA was not just about protecting his property. It was about setting an example. If he could prove that one person could stand up, maybe others would find the courage to do the same. Back at home, he created a detailed timeline of the road's history. He started with old maps showing the road's construction, noted each repair and improvement, and added photographs from different decades. He even included newspaper clippings that mentioned the road and the property. Every piece of evidence told the same story. The road had been privately owned long before the HOA existed. He also began documenting the HOA's actions meticulously. Each letter, each visit, each interaction with representatives was recorded. Dates, times, names, and details of conversations were all written down. He knew that if the situation escalated, having a clear or organized record could make the difference between winning and losing. During this time, tension in the neighborhood grew. He noticed more signs of subtle pressure from the HOA. Some neighbors suddenly painted their fences the correct color, trimmed trees to the exact height allowed by the rules, or added signage that matched HOA standards. It was clear that the board wanted everyone to comply fully, not just him. The letters and fines were a message. The HOA had control, and resistance would not be tolerated. Despite the stress, he tried to keep a routine. He mowed the lawn, tended to his garden, and repaired small issues around the house. Each task reminded him of what he was protecting. The road, his home, and his family's history were not just property, they were his responsibility. He refused to let fear take that away. One evening, a group of HOA representatives arrived without warning. This time there were 3 of them, carrying clipboards and cameras. They walked along the road, inspecting every corner, measuring distances, and taking notes. He met them at the driveway and asked again to see documentation proving the HOA's authority over the road. They refused. Instead, one of them said, "We are simply ensuring compliance with community standards." He stood firm. "This is private property," he said. "I have documents, deeds, and maps proving ownership. You are not authorized to inspect or measure it without my permission." The representatives glanced at each other, then muttered something about reporting him to the board. They left shortly after, but the encounter left him more resolved. It was clear that the HOA's tactics were not legal. They were intimidation. The more they tried to pressure him, the more he realized the importance of preparation. The next day, began organizing meetings with neighbors who had expressed concern. They met quietly in living rooms, sharing stories about fines, inspections, and threats. Many admitted they were too afraid to confront the HOA, but they were inspired by his determination. One neighbor even offered old documents from when the neighborhood was first built, which could help strengthen his case. He also started reaching out to legal experts. He wanted advice, not necessarily to start a lawsuit immediately, but to understand his options. The more he learned, the more confident he became. There were clear legal grounds to challenge the HOA, and the letters and visits were not supported by law. He began to see a path forward, a way to protect the road and ensure that the HOA could not overreach. Night. He often walked the road alone, thinking about the coming battle. The quiet of the neighborhood contrasted sharply with the tension that had grown over the past weeks. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the gravel crunched softly under his feet, and for a moment, it felt as though nothing could touch the road. But he knew that the fight was only beginning. He started creating a presentation of sorts, organizing all the documents, photographs, and records into a clear package. Each piece was labeled, each date confirmed, and each connection explained. It was a laborious process, but it was necessary. If the HOA refused to listen, he would need something undeniable to show the truth. The homeowner also paid close attention to every interaction with the board. Emails, phone calls, and letters were all saved and cataloged. He knew that one small mistake could be used against him, so he was careful to respond politely but firmly, never showing anger or frustration. Professionalism, he realized, was as important as evidence. Meanwhile, the HOA's tactics continued. Notices appeared in mailboxes, sometimes referring vaguely to road compliance issues or community property inspections. He heard reports from neighbors about board members showing up at other homes, asking questions and subtly pressuring them to support the HOA's claims. It became clear that the board was trying to control the narrative, to isolate him as the sole opponent. Despite this, the homeowner began to feel a quiet confidence growing. Every document he found, every photograph he collected, and every conversation with knowledgeable neighbors reinforced the truth. He was not just defending a road. He was defending what was right. One day, a longtime neighbor shared a piece of advice that stuck with him. The HOA only wins if you let them, the neighbor said. They rely on fear, confusion, and silence. Don't give them that. Stand firm, document everything, and don't let them make you doubt yourself. Those words echoed in his mind. The road had always been more than just a path to his home. It had been a place of memories, of quiet mornings, of afternoons spent fixing potholes and spreading gravel. It was part of his life, and he would not let anyone take it away through intimidation or false claims. By the end of the week, he had organized all the evidence, spoken to neighbors, and consulted legal experts. The situation had reached a critical point. He understood that the next steps would determine the future of the road, and possibly the behavior of the HOA in the neighborhood. He also knew that courage was contagious. Even if only a few neighbors chose to support him, it could change the dynamics of the conflict. By standing up, he was creating an example, showing that unfair claims could be challenged. And that intimidation was not invincible as he walked the road that evening. The sun setting behind the trees, he felt a mixture of resolve and anticipation. The letters, the visits, and the threats were not going to stop him. The road was his, the evidence was clear, and he was ready to fight. And in that quiet moment, he understood something important. This fight was bigger than just a road. It was about fairness, about standing up to power when it is misused, and about protecting what is rightfully yours. The coming weeks would be difficult, but he was prepared. The road had been his for decades, and he would make sure it stayed that way, no matter what the HOA tried next. The tension in the neighborhood had grown to a level that felt almost unbearable. Every interaction, every letter, and every visit from the HOA seemed to carry more weight than before. The homeowner had spent countless hours organizing documents, collecting photographs, and consulting legal advice. He was prepared, but the anticipation of the confrontation ahead kept him awake at night. The road, once quiet and unremarkable, had become the center of a growing storm. One morning, a letter arrived that changed everything. Unlike the previous notices, this one was an official request for a public HOA meeting, where they intended to discuss road compliance and community authority. It was written in formal language, signed by the board president, and included a warning that failure to attend could result in additional fines and actions. The homeowner read it slowly, absorbing each word. This was his chance to face the HOA directly, in front of witnesses, and present his evidence. He began preparing immediately. The previous weeks had been about gathering facts, documenting every interaction, and building a clear record. Now, he needed to organize those facts into a story that made sense to everyone in the room. He spent hours reviewing property deeds, historical maps, repair receipts, and photographs. Each piece of evidence was placed in chronological order, highlighting the fact that the road had been private for decades. He knew that clarity and structure would be crucial as the day of the meeting approached. He could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors whispered when he walked past, some offering encouragement, others warning him about the strength of the HOA board. He ignored the warnings, focusing instead on what he knew to be true. The road was his property, and the evidence was undeniable. When the day arrived, the meeting room was crowded. Board members sat behind a long table, papers stacked neatly in front of them. Several residents were present, curious about the conflict, while others looked uneasy, as though they had already decided which side they would support. The atmosphere was formal, tense, and quiet, filled with the weight of anticipation. The homeowner walked in carrying a thick folder of evidence. He set it on the table in front of him, carefully arranging the documents so they could be easily reviewed. When the board president began speaking, explaining the alleged violations and fines, he listened patiently, waiting for the right moment to respond. When it was his turn, he spoke calmly and clearly. He presented the history of the road, showing maps from decades ago, deeds listing the road as part of his property, and photographs documenting the road's maintenance over the years. He explained that the road predated the formation of the HOA and that no legal action had ever transferred ownership. His tone was firm but respectful, emphasizing facts rather than emotion. The room was silent as he laid out the evidence. Residents leaned forward, curious and attentive. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for such a detailed and organized presentation. One board member attempted to interrupt, questioning the validity of an old survey, but he responded politely, explaining the survey's official record and its legal significance. The board member sat back, momentarily speechless. Several neighbors who had received letters from the HOA began nodding quietly, recognizing that the claims against him might be overreaching. Some whispered to each other, sharing stories of similar intimidation they had experienced. The homeowner realized that his preparation was not only protecting the road, but also shedding light on the HOA's broader pattern of behavior. The board president grew increasingly defensive. He tried to assert authority, claiming that the road fell under HOA jurisdiction and that their fines were valid. The homeowner responded with more evidence, including legal documents and photographs, leaving little room for argument. The room grew tense, and for the first time, it was clear that the HOA's confidence was faltering. A resident raised a hand and asked a question about the legality of the board's actions. The homeowner answered carefully, explaining that while HOAs can manage common areas, the law clearly distinguished private property from community property. He emphasized that the road had never been transferred to the HOA, and therefore, any fines or penalties were without legal standing. The board members whispered among themselves, their discomfort growing. The homeowner remained calm, answering questions as they came, referencing his documents and legal advice. He could see the shift happening. The power dynamic was changing. What had started as intimidation and letters demanding payment was now being challenged openly, in front of witnesses and with evidence that could not be ignored. At one point, a longtime resident stood and spoke up. They shared a story about how they had been pressured by the HOA in the past and expressed support for the homeowner's evidence. The room responded with murmurs of agreement. It became clear that several residents were beginning to question the board's authority and tactics. The homeowner noticed subtle changes in the board members' behavior. Their posture stiffened, voices lowered, and attempts at interruptions became hesitant. The clear and organized presentation of facts had shifted the room's energy. No longer was he just a single voice. He had the support and attention of the neighborhood. The board's position was weakening. Throughout the meeting, he remained focused on one goal, demonstrating the truth. He did not let anger or frustration guide his words, knowing that civility and clarity were far more powerful than confrontation. Each document he referenced, each photograph he displayed, reinforced the undeniable reality that the road was privately owned, that the HOA's claims were baseless. By mid-afternoon, the tension had reached a turning point. The board president, visibly uncomfortable, asked for a recess to review the evidence presented. Residents whispered among themselves, sharing impressions and speculating about the outcome. The homeowner used the break to check his folder, ensuring everything was organized and ready. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Weeks of preparation, research, and documentation had led to this moment. When the meeting resumed, the board president spoke in a subdued tone. He admitted that the board needed to review their records further and agreed to postpone any enforcement actions until the evidence could be fully examined. While not a complete victory, this was a significant step. The HOA, which had started the conflict with threats and fines, was now forced to reconsider its position in front of witnesses. Several residents approached the homeowner after the meeting, thanking him for standing up and sharing his evidence. They admitted that they had been intimidated by the HOA in the past, but felt inspired by his courage. Some even offered old documents and photographs to support his case further. The homeowner realized that the impact of his actions extended beyond the road. It was helping the neighborhood regain confidence in standing up to unfair authority. Over the next few days, word spread. Neighbors discussed the meeting, sharing details of the evidence and the board's reaction. The HOA began receiving inquiries and complaints from residents who wanted clarification about their own properties and fines. The homeowner continued organizing additional documentation, ready for the next stage if the board attempted further action. The situation had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a personal struggle over a single road had turned into a broader conversation about fairness, authority, and the limits of HOA power. The homeowner understood that the fight was not over, but he also recognized that the momentum was now on his side. Late one evening, he walked the road in quiet reflection. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm. The road, which had been the center of conflict and tension, was once again a place of clarity and purpose. He had faced the intimidation, presented the truth, and seen the beginnings of change. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. The HOA could regroup, attempt to dispute the evidence, or escalate in other ways. But he also knew that preparation, clarity, and courage had already made a difference. The board, residents, and neighborhood had witnessed that one person, armed with facts and determination, could stand against power used unfairly. In the days following the meeting, the homeowner continued gathering evidence, documenting interactions, and consulting legal advice. Each step reinforced his understanding that the road was not just a private path to his home, it was a symbol of standing up for what was right. The letters, fines, and intimidation had tested him, but they had also strengthened his resolve and taught him the value of preparation, persistence, and calm determination. The neighborhood, too, began to change subtly. Residents who had once avoided conflict now spoke more openly. They shared concerns, offered evidence, and discussed strategies for ensuring fairness in the community. The homeowner realized that by standing firm, he had sparked a quiet movement, encouraging others to question authority and protect their own rights. By the end of the week, the road felt different. It was still the same path leading to his home, lined with the familiar trees and worn gravel, but it carried a new meaning. It was a testament to persistence, preparation, and courage. The HOA, once confident and intimidating, now faced undeniable evidence and a growing community of residents. Questioning its authority, the homeowner knew that more challenges were coming. But he also understood that he had already won something invaluable: respect, clarity, and the knowledge that he could face unfair authority with courage and evidence. The road had been at the center of conflict, but it had also become the center of change. And as he walked slowly down the gravel path that evening, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The fight was far from over, but the tide had turned. The HOA could no longer act with impunity. The road, his road, remained a symbol of truth, preparation, and the power of standing firm when it mattered most. The weeks following the public meeting were filled with anticipation, attention, and a quiet determination. The homeowner knew the HOA would be forced to respond to the evidence he had presented, but he also understood that they could attempt to fight back in subtle ways. Every day brought letters, emails, and occasional phone calls from the board. Some were polite, others pointed, and a few carried veiled threats. But he remained calm, organized, and prepared. Neighbors began noticing the change. Some approached him cautiously, curious about the outcome of the meeting. Others shared stories of their own small encounters with the HOA, admitting that they had been intimidated but never stood up for themselves. Each conversation reminded him that his fight was not just for the road. It was for fairness and clarity in the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, the board sent an official notice requesting another meeting, this time to review all the documentation and evidence he had provided. Unlike previous notices, this one sounded almost hesitant. It acknowledged the volume of information and suggested that a fair resolution might be possible. The homeowners sensed the shift immediately. The board was no longer confident and unchallenged. They were now aware that their previous actions had created more problems than they anticipated. The day of the meeting arrived, and the homeowner prepared carefully. He reviewed every piece of evidence, checking dates, signatures, and photographs. He rehearsed how he would explain each document clearly and calmly. This was the moment where everything he had worked for over the past months would be tested. When he arrived at the meeting, he noticed the board members looking uneasy. Their confident demeanor had faded, replaced with cautious gestures and careful glances. Several residents were also present, silently observing, their curiosity and support evident in the way they leaned forward and paid close attention. He began by summarizing the history of the road. He explained that it had been privately owned for decades, maintained by property owners, and fully documented through deeds, surveys, and photographs. He showed receipts from repairs and improvements, emphasizing that every effort had been made by the property owner to care for the road. He spoke calmly, clearly, and respectfully, focusing on facts rather than emotion.